The crystal champagne flute in Nathaniel Pierce's hand caught the light of a dozen chandeliers, a starburst of brilliance in a room built on lies. He was toasting his future, his gaze locked on the sultry blonde beside him, a woman who was not his wife. Across the grand ballroom, the city's elite watched whispering behind their hands. What Nathaniel didn't know was that his wife Josephine, 6 months pregnant with his heir, was watching from the wings of the stage. And she wasn't just a guest tonight. She was about to be introduced as the new chairwoman of the very foundation he was trying to impress. The applause was for him. The power was all hers. The air in the back of the Bentley was a sterile, climate-controlled silence, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Josephine Davenport Pierce. Her hand rested instinctively on the gentle swell of her belly, a small, solid anchor in the churning sea of her emotions. Outside, the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan glittered like a river of scattered diamonds. A view that once filled her with a sense of belonging, but now felt alienating cold. She was on her way to the 15th annual Starlight Children's Foundation Gala, the crown jewel of New York's philanthropic season, an event her family had championed for 3 generations. Tonight, however, it felt less like a homecoming and more like walking into a meticulously set trap. For the past 4 months, her husband, Nathaniel Pierce, had been a ghost in their Fifth Avenue penthouse. He was a man made of late-night arrivals that smelled of a perfume not her own, a cloying, musky scent she'd identified as black orchid, and early morning departures before the sun had a chance to expose the lies from the night before. He'd become an expert in plausible deniability. The long hours were for the Japanese merger, a deal that would supposedly cement his legacy. The weekend trips were for investor meetings in Geneva. The hushed phone calls he took on the terrace were with legal counsel. Nathaniel was a titan of tech, a self-made millionaire who had clawed his way up from a background so unremarkable he refused to speak of it. He had the kind of ruthless ambition that both fascinated and terrified the old money establishment. He'd pursued Josephine with that same relentless focus, seeing in her not just a woman he desired, but a dynasty. The Davenport name was a key one that opened doors his billions couldn't. For a time, she believed his affection was genuine. He was charming, attentive, and made her feel like the center of a universe he was building just for them. Now that universe felt like a gilded cage. The signs had been subtle at first. A credit card statement she'd seen by accident listing extravagant purchases from Cartier and La Perla gifts she had never received. A stray blonde hair on the cashmere throw of his private jet. Whispers from her circle of friends couched in concerned questions. "Is everything all right, Josie? We haven't seen you and Nate out together in ages." The final brutal confirmation had come not from a private investigator, but from the vapid, glossy pages of a gossip blog. A grainy photo taken with a long lens showed Nathaniel on a yacht in St. Bart's, his arm draped possessively around a willowy blonde. Her name, the article gleefully reported, was Chloe Decker, a 24-year-old Instagram model and aspiring actress whose primary talent seemed to be attaching herself to powerful men. The caption read, "Tech mogul Nate Pierce warms up with a new model in the Caribbean sun." Josephine had stared at the image on her tablet until it blurred through her tears. It wasn't just the betrayal that cut so deeply. It was the public nature of it, the sheer arrogant carelessness. He wasn't even trying to hide it. It was a message, a declaration that he had outgrown her, that the security and legacy she represented were no longer enough to satisfy his voracious appetite for more. Her first instinct was to shatter something. Her second was to call her father Robert Davenport. He listened to her choked sobs without interruption, his silence a comforting, solid presence over the phone line. When she was finished, his voice was calm, but with an underlying edge of steel that had made corporate raiders tremble. "Josephine," he said, "you will not give him the satisfaction of a public breakdown. You are a Davenport. We do not crumble. We consolidate, we strategize, and we win. The gala is tonight. You know what you have to do." He was right. Crying in her penthouse would achieve nothing. The plan they had been formulating for the past 2 weeks, a contingency she had prayed she would never have to use, was now her only path forward. It was a plan born of quiet strength and devastating precision. The Bentley pulled up to the curb in front of Cipriani Wall Street. The grand columned facade was illuminated in sapphire blue light. Photographers swarmed the red carpet, their flashes creating a stroboscopic, disorienting effect. Josephine took a deep, steadying breath, the cool air filling her lungs. Her driver, a man who had been with her family for 30 years, opened her door. "Mrs. Pierce," he said, his voice soft with unspoken sympathy. She gave him a small, determined smile. "It's Miss Davenport tonight, Thomas. Just for tonight." She stepped out of the car. She wore a bespoke gown of deep emerald silk that fell gracefully over her pregnant form, a color that accentuated the feu in her auburn hair and the fierce resolve in her green eyes. She didn't wear the ostentatious 20-carat diamond Nathaniel had given her. Instead, on her hand was a single magnificent emerald ring that had belonged to her grandmother, a symbol of Davenport matriarchal strength. She paused for the cameras, her expression serene, regal. She was not a victim. She was the calm at the center of a hurricane she was about to unleash. Inside the ballroom was a breathtaking spectacle of power and wealth. Soaring marble columns reached up to a domed ceiling painted with frescoes, and crystal chandeliers the size of small cars dripped light onto the assembled guests. The air hummed with the murmur of 1,000 conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the soft strains of a string quartet. This was Josephine's world, a world of hushed influence and unspoken rules, a world Nathaniel had so desperately wanted to conquer. She moved through the crowd with an easy grace, greeting fellow board members, old family friends, and city dignitaries. Each smile she offered was genuine, yet guarded. They saw Josephine Davenport, the elegant, pregnant heiress, the perfect hostess. They saw nothing of the shattered woman beneath the silk armor. She exchanged pleasantries with a U.S. senator and discussed a new pediatric wing with the CEO of Mount Sinai. She was performing the role she was born to, a dance of diplomacy and charm she had mastered before she could walk. Her eyes scanned the room, a predator's sweep masked by social grace. And then she saw them. Nathaniel stood near the towering ice sculpture of a swan, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was laughing that deep, booming laugh that had once captivated her. Now it sounded hollow and grating. And beside him, clinging to his arm like a designer accessory, was Chloe Decker. Chloe was everything Josephine was not. Where Josephine was classic elegance, Chloe was overt, almost vulgar sensuality. She was poured into a shimmering gold dress that left little to the imagination, her platinum blonde hair styled in a way that screamed for attention. She gazed up at Nathaniel with a look of pure adoration, but her eyes darted around the room, cataloguing every important face drinking in the wealth and power that surrounded her. She wasn't in love. She was auditioning. A wave of nausea sharper than any morning sickness she had experienced washed over Josephine. to bring her here, to this event. The Starlight Gala wasn't just another charity function. It was the heart of the Davenport family's legacy. It was a sanctuary of hope built by her grandmother to honor a child she had lost. For Nathaniel to desecrate this space with his tawdry affair was an act of profound disrespect, a calculated strike against everything she held sacred. Whispers followed the couple like a trail of smoke. Heads turned, eyes widened. Old money matrons fanned themselves with their programs, their faces masks of delicious scandal. They pitied Josephine, but they were also thrilled by the drama. This was better than Broadway. Nathaniel finally spotted Josephine across the room. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of something guilt surprise crossed his face. He hadn't expected her to come. In his arrogance, he likely assumed she would be at home weeping into her pillow. He disentangled himself from Chloe murmuring something in her ear and began to make his way towards his wife. "Josie." He began, his voice a low, placating hum as he reached her. "I'm glad you made it. I was worried you weren't feeling up to it." "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Nathaniel," she replied, her voice cool and even. She didn't look at him instead, keeping her gaze on a point over his shoulder. "It's a very important night for my family." She emphasized the word my. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Listen about—" He gestured vaguely back towards Chloe, who was now pretending to be fascinated by the ice sculpture. "It's not what it looks like. She's the daughter of a business associate, a potential investor. I'm just being hospitable." The lie was so bald-faced, so insulting in its lack of effort, that Josephine almost laughed. He thought she was a fool. After all this time, he still believed she was the naive, trusting girl he had married, not the woman who had spent a lifetime watching men like him operate. "Is that so?" she said, finally meeting his eyes. Her gaze was flat, devoid of the warmth he was used to. "Then you won't mind if I don't ask you to join me at the head table. I'm sure your guest would feel out of place, sitting with my father." Before he could respond, her father, Robert Davenport, appeared at her side. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 60s, with a full head of silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. He completely ignored Nathaniel, placing a protective hand on his daughter's arm. "Josephine, my dear, Senator Thompson is asking for you," he said, his voice a calm counterpoint to the tension radiating from Nathaniel. He then turned his head slowly, his gaze falling upon Nathaniel with the force of a physical blow. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look of pure, unadulterated contempt was enough. As Robert led Josephine away, she allowed herself one last glance over her shoulder. She saw Nathaniel standing alone, his face a thunderous mask of fury and humiliation. He had wanted to make a statement tonight, to show this world that he was his own man, bound by no one. And in a way, he had succeeded. He had just made the wrong statement to the wrong people. He retreated back to Chloe's side, his posture rigid, grabbing 2 glasses of champagne from a passing waiter and handing one to her. He was doubling down. It was a fatal miscalculation. The first act of the evening was over. The players were in position. Now all Josephine had to do was wait for his cue. The evening progressed with the clockwork precision of all Davenport-hosted events. The dinner service was flawless. The speeches from the hospital beneficiaries were heartwarming, and the silent auction was raising astronomical sums. From her seat at the head table nestled between her father and the mayor of New York, Josephine played her part to perfection. She smiled, she applauded, she made gracious conversation. All the while she was acutely aware of Nathaniel and Chloe at a table across the room, sponsored by his tech company, Pierce Innovations. They were putting on a show. Chloe laughed a little too loudly, her hand constantly finding its way to Nathaniel's arm or shoulder. Nathaniel, for his part, leaned into her, whispering in her ear, creating a bubble of intimacy in the cavernous ballroom. He was performing defiance, trying to project an image of a man unbothered, a king holding court. But Josephine could see the tightness in his jaw, the way his eyes kept flicking towards the head table. He was rattled. He was used to being the one in control, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Then came the part of the evening reserved for major donors. The Gala's master of ceremonies, a well-known news anchor, took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice resonating through the hall, "tonight we have been blessed with incredible generosity, and one of our most significant patrons this year is a man whose name is synonymous with innovation and forward-thinking, the CEO of Pierce Innovations, Mr. Nathaniel Pierce." A polite but strained applause rippled through the room. Nathaniel stood up, straightening his bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo. He gave Chloe's hand a squeeze before striding towards the stage, the spotlight following him. He was in his element now, the center of attention. Josephine felt her heart begin to pound, a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it. Nathaniel took the microphone, a confident, predatory smile on his face. He started with the expected platitudes, thanking the foundation, praising the doctors, and talking about the importance of investing in the future. He was a gifted public speaker, his words weaving a spell of corporate responsibility and heartfelt philanthropy. "We build skyscrapers of steel and glass," he said, his voice resonating with passion. "We write code that connects the globe, but none of it matters if we don't build a foundation of hope for our children. That's what the Starlight Foundation does. It builds hope." The crowd was warming too. He was winning them over. Josephine watched her expression unreadable. Her father placed a reassuring hand over hers on the table. Nathaniel was nearing the end of his speech. "And so as we look to the future, we must embrace new beginnings. We must have the courage to shed the past, to let go of what holds us back, and to invest in the brilliant, dazzling possibilities that lie just ahead." His eyes left the general audience and scanned the room until they found Chloe. He locked his gaze with hers. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. Everyone who had seen the gossip blogs, everyone who had been whispering all night, knew what was happening. This was no longer a speech about charity. It was a declaration. A waiter brought him a glass of champagne on stage. He raised it high. "So I ask you all to join me," he proclaimed, his voice ringing with triumph. "Raise a glass with me to a future that shines brighter than we ever imagined, to new and brilliant partnerships, to building a legacy that will truly last, to the future." As he finished, he didn't look at his wife. He didn't look at the esteemed guests at the head table. He looked directly at Chloe Decker, a private, intimate smile playing on his lips. It was the most public act of infidelity Josephine had ever witnessed. It was a toast to his mistress in a room full of his wife's family and friends at an event honoring her family's legacy. He had just detonated a bomb in the middle of his own life, and he was smiling, thinking he was the only one who would walk away from the blast. The applause was scattered, uncertain. The meaning of his words, of his pointed gaze, hung in the air thick and suffocating. The scandal was no longer a whisper. It was a confirmed, undeniable fact, served up on a silver platter for all of New York society to consume. Nathaniel, basking in what he believed was his moment of victory, walked off the stage. He didn't see the look on Robert Davenport's face, a look of cold, murderous rage. He didn't see the pitying glances being sent toward the head table. And most importantly, he didn't see the terrifyingly calm, almost serene expression that had settled over his wife. He thought he had just ended a chapter. He had no idea she was about to burn the entire book. As Nathaniel returned to his table, greeted by a beaming Chloe, who kissed him with theatrical passion, a profound stillness settled over Josephine. The roaring in her ears subsided. The frantic pounding of her heart slowed to a steady, resolute rhythm. The pain was still there, a white-hot ember deep in her chest, but it was being rapidly cooled by something else, an icy, crystalline certainty. He had given her the gift of clarity. There were no more doubts, no more hopes for reconciliation, no more wondering if she was misreading the signs. He had shown her and the entire world exactly who he was, and in doing so, he had freed her. She turned to her father. His face was a mask of controlled fury. His knuckles were white where he gripped his water glass. "Are you ready, my dear?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Josephine met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw not the fragility of a heart-broken daughter, but the reflection of his own iron will. "More than ready," she said, her voice clear and without a tremor. "He just wrote the introduction to my speech for me." She excused herself from the table, needing a moment alone before the maelstrom. She didn't retreat to the powder room, where she would be met with sympathetic whispers and cloying pity. Instead, she walked with purpose towards the backstage area, her emerald gown flowing behind her. A stagehand headset on moved to stop her, but faltered when he saw the look on her face. She found a small, dark alcove behind a stack of equipment cases. The sounds of the gala were muffled here, a distant, surreal hum. Leaning against the cool brick wall, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, focusing on the tiny life inside her. This was no longer just about her own pain or pride. This was about the future of her child, a future she would not allow to be shaped by a man of such casual cruelty and profound weakness. She would not raise her son or daughter in a house built on lies. She would build them a fortress of truth and integrity, and she would lay the first stone tonight. Her mother, who had passed away 3 years ago, had been the chairwoman of the Starlight Foundation for 25 years. It had been her life's work. After a long illness, she had passed the torch to Josephine in her will, a secret kept within the family and the Foundation's inner circle, pending a formal announcement. The plan had always been for Josephine to be revealed tonight, a surprise to the philanthropic community. Her mother had envisioned it as a triumphant moment, a passing of the generational mantle. Now it would be a coronation of a different sort. Her phone buzzed in her small clutch. It was a text from her lawyer, a man whose retainer was almost as legendary as his ruthlessness. All assets frozen. He can't move a dime. The board is on standby. Another buzz. This one from the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, a woman Josephine had known since childhood. "We're ready to run with the story. Your statement is all we need." Everything was in place. The legal mechanisms, the media narrative, the board's allegiance. For the past 2 weeks, since she first suspected the depths of Nathaniel's betrayal, she and her father had been moving pieces around a chessboard he didn't even know he was playing on. They had leveraged every ounce of Davenport influence, called in favors decades old, and prepared for a war he had obliviously started. She pulled out a small stack of index cards from her clutch. On them, in her elegant script, were the bullet points for her original speech, a speech filled with hope, legacy, and her mother's memory. She looked at them for a moment, then calmly, deliberately tore them in half, and then in half again. The pieces fluttered from her fingers onto the dusty floor. She didn't need a script anymore. Nathaniel had given her all the material she needed. A young production assistant peeked around the corner. "Mrs. Pierce, Mr. Davenport said to tell you. It's time." Josephine straightened up, smoothing the front of her gown over her belly. She felt the baby kick a small, reassuring flutter. A slow, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time that night. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated power. She walked from the shadows of the wings towards the stage, her posture perfect, her head held high. The stillness was over. The storm was about to break. The news anchor returned to the podium, a broad, professional smile plastered on his face, belying the electric tension that had seized the room. The air was thick with it. Guests were no longer talking amongst themselves. They were watching, waiting. The drama was far from over, and they knew it. "And now," the anchor announced, his voice regaining its cheerful cadence, "we come to a very special moment in the history of the Starlight Children's Foundation. For 25 years, this organization was guided by the indomitable spirit and loving hand of the late, great Adrian Davenport." A warm, respectful applause filled the hall. A large photo of Josephine's mother, elegant and smiling, appeared on the giant screens flanking the stage. Josephine watched from the wings, a pang of love and grief mixing with her cold resolve. "Her legacy is immeasurable," the anchor continued, "and for the past few months, the question of who could possibly fill her shoes has been on everyone's mind. Tonight, it is my distinct honor to announce that the Board of Directors has unanimously elected a new chairwoman to lead the foundation into the next generation. A woman who embodies the same grace, intelligence, and dedication as her mother before her." At his table, Nathaniel Pierce leaned back, a smirk on his face. He whispered something to Chloe, who giggled. He assumed this was some elderly board member, a placeholder. The Davenport legacy in his mind was a relic. He was the future. Josephine took one final deep breath and stepped into the light. "Ladies and gentlemen," the anchor boomed, his voice swelling with importance, "please join me in welcoming the new chairwoman of the Starlight Children's Foundation, Mrs. Josephine Davenport Pierce." A single powerful spotlight hit Josephine as she emerged from the wings. For a full 3 seconds, there was absolute stunned silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Across the vast ballroom, 1,000 pairs of eyes were fixed on the pregnant woman in the emerald gown, her expression poised and unyielding. Then the sound hit. It wasn't the polite, scattered applause from before. It was a roar. It started at the head table where her father stood leading the ovation. It spread like a wildfire through the room as the full, shocking implication of the moment dawned on everyone. This wasn't just an announcement. It was a counter-move. It was a coup. Josephine's gaze swept across the sea of faces until it landed on Nathaniel. The color drained from his face. His confident smirk dissolved into a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. His glass, halfway to his lips, froze in midair. He looked from Josephine on the stage to her father, who was now staring at him with undisguised hatred, and back to Josephine. The trap had sprung, and his own leg was caught in its steel jaws. Beside him, Chloe Decker's glamorous facade cracked. Her painted smile faltered, replaced by a look of confusion, and then dawning horror. The powerful man she had attached herself to was suddenly looking very, very small. The adoring gazes she had been soaking up all night had turned to ones of pity and contempt. She was no longer the exciting home-wrecker. She was just the tacky, foolish mistress, a casualty in a war she hadn't even known was being waged. Josephine walked gracefully to the podium, the applause thundering around her. She shook the anchor's hand, her smile never wavering. She adjusted the microphone, her movements deliberate and calm. The applause slowly died down, replaced by a silence so absolute, so heavy with anticipation, that a dropped pin would have sounded like a gunshot. Every single person in that room understood. The wife had just taken the stage, and the real show was about to begin. Josephine looked out at the silent, expectant crowd, her gaze calm and steady. She did not look at her husband. To look at him would be to acknowledge him, and he had ceased to exist in her world. He was now merely a problem to be managed, a piece to be swept from the board. "Thank you," she began, her voice resonating with a quiet authority that commanded the room's full attention. It was her mother's voice, imbued with her own steely resolve. "Thank you all. I am deeply honored and humbled to accept the position of chairwoman for the Starlight Children's Foundation, an organization that has been the heart and soul of my family for as long as I can remember." She paused, letting the weight of her lineage settle over the audience. "My mother, Adrienne Davenport, built this foundation on a simple but unshakable principle that our first and most sacred duty is to protect the vulnerable. She believed in integrity in legacy and in the strength of family. Not just the family we are born into, but the family we build around us, a community bound by trust, loyalty, and a shared moral compass." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart. Trust, loyalty, moral compass. The subtext was so clear it was practically text. The air grew colder. "As I step into this role," she continued, her hand gently resting on her belly, "I do so with an eye toward the future. A future for the children we serve, and a future for my own child. It is a future that must be built upon the same solid bedrock of principles my mother established. There is no room for compromise. There is no place for those whose actions undermine the very values we profess to uphold." She picked up a sheet of paper from the podium. It was not her torn speech. It was a legal document. "To that end, my first act as chairwoman, approved unanimously by the board of directors this afternoon, is to introduce a new addendum to our bylaws. It will be known as the Davenport Integrity Covenant. This covenant establishes a morality clause for all board members and major patrons of this foundation." A collective gasp went through the room. Nathaniel, who sat on the board as part of his marriage into the family, finally moved. He looked as if he had been turned to stone and was only now thawing a look of pure panic in his eyes. "This covenant states," Josephine read her voice, ringing with the clarity of a judge passing sentence, "that any individual whose public conduct brings dishonor or disrepute upon the foundation who engages in acts of moral turpitude that conflict with our mission to support children and families will be subject to immediate and permanent removal from the board and all associated committees. Their funding will be returned, and their name will be stricken from our donor rolls." She placed the paper down and looked out at the audience once more. "There will be no exceptions. This foundation is a sanctuary, not a stage for personal dramas or a shield for indefensible behavior. Our name, the Davenport name, and the name of this foundation will stand for one thing and one thing only: unwavering integrity. The message was delivered. She had just with surgical precision, and without ever saying his name publicly, executed her husband's social and philanthropic career. He was finished. Everyone in the room knew it. The power he had craved the acceptance into their world had been revoked. Then she delivered the final personal blow. This is a new era for the Foundation, and it is a new beginning for me as well. I will be leading this organization and raising my child under the name I was born with, the name my mother gave me. From this day forward, I will be known only as Josephine Davenport. She had not just divorced him in the court of public opinion. She had erased him from her very identity. She had taken back her name, her power, her life, and her family's legacy all in a 5-minute speech. She concluded with a simple, powerful statement. Thank you. And now let us rededicate ourselves to the important work of helping the children. For a moment, there was silence again. The silence of a collective shock. Then one person began to clap. It was an elderly woman at a nearby table, a Rockefeller by birth. Then another, a man who ran one of Wall Street's most powerful banks. Then her father. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted. The applause was not just polite. It was thunderous, a genuine, overwhelming wave of support and admiration. They were not clapping for a victim. They were giving a standing ovation to a queen who had just defended her throne with breathtaking elegance and lethality. The standing ovation was a physical force, a wall of sound that slammed into Nathaniel Pierce and nailed him to his chair. It went on and on, a relentless, rolling thunder of approval for the woman who had just dismantled his life with the grace of a concert pianist. He sat paralyzed in the eye of the hurricane. A frozen, ghastly smile stretched across his face. He felt the heat of 1,000 eyes on him, not with admiration, but with a morbid, clinical curiosity, like scientists observing a specimen in its death throes. His mind, usually a sharp, predatory instrument, was a chaotic swirl of disbelief and white-hot rage. How? How did she do this? Beside him, Chloe Decker's carefully constructed poise had completely disintegrated. The adoration in her eyes had been replaced with raw animal panic. Her hand gripped his arm, her nails digging into the fine wool of his tuxedo jacket. "Nate," she hissed, her voice, a strained, desperate whisper that was barely audible over the applause. "Nate, what is happening? Fix this. Get up there, say something." He looked at her. Truly. Looked at her, and saw not a glamorous partner, but a terrified girl who had bet on the wrong horse. The other guests at his corporate table, men who had been laughing at his jokes and flattering him minutes earlier, now seemed to have developed a sudden intense interest in their dinner rolls. They wouldn't meet his eye. He was a social contagion, and they were desperate to avoid infection. The applause finally began to subside, but the atmosphere it left behind was even worse. A thick, suffocating silence descended, punctuated by a rising tide of whispers. From across the room, Nathaniel watched as his wife was enveloped by a circle of the city's true power brokers. He saw Richard Callahan, a rival developer he'd publicly mocked just last month, approach Josephine. Callahan took her hand, bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect, and then said something that made her father, Robert Davenport, laugh a real booming laugh. Callahan then cast a single dismissive glance across the room at Nathaniel, a look of such triumphant contempt that it was more insulting than any verbal blow. He had been excommunicated. We're leaving." Nathaniel finally growled the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. He shoved his chair back with a loud scrape that drew more attention. Their exit was a slow, agonizing walk of shame across 100 yards of plush carpeting that now felt like a mile of broken glass. As they passed tables, conversations would abruptly halt, only to resume in venomous whispers the moment they were past. The arrogance of the man. Toasted his own mistress. She annihilated him without ever raising her voice. Pure Davenport. That poor, foolish girl. Chloe, her face blotchy and pale under her makeup, stumbled slightly, her stiletto heel catching on the carpet. Nathaniel grabbed her arm, yanking her upright, with a roughness born of pure frustration. The entire ballroom saw the graceless, ugly moment. They were no longer a power couple. They were a spectacle of ruin. As they reached the grand lobby, they could see a chaotic storm of light through the ornate glass doors. The press, far more of them than before. Josephine's team had clearly given them a new headline to chase. The moment the doors opened, the storm broke over them. A blinding barrage of camera flashes turned the rainy night into a flickering, disorienting nightmare. Microphones and phones were shoved in their faces. The reporters were like sharks in a feeding frenzy. "Mr. Pierce, is it true you've been removed from the Starlight Board? Chloe, was he worth it? Nathaniel, what will this do to your company's stock on Monday? Was your toast to your mistress worth your entire fortune?" That last question, shouted by a sharp-faced reporter from the Post, struck a nerve. Nathaniel, his composure completely shredded, shoved a cameraman out of his way. "No comment, get out of my way!" He snarled, the sound of his own desperate voice only adding to his humiliation. He pulled Chloe through the scrum, her sobs now audible as they finally burst free onto the rain-slicked sidewalk. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking with fury as he tried to call his driver. As the screen lit up, a new email notification glowed ominously at the top. The sender was his chief legal counsel. The subject, urgent court order. Asset freeze and board removal. He stared at it, the raindrops splattering on the screen, blurring the words that confirmed his utter ruin. While he had been preening and posturing her, lawyers had been executing a perfectly timed legal ambush. He was a billionaire on paper, but at this moment he was locked out of his own empire. A sleek black town car, not his own, glided to a stop at the curb. The back door opened, but it wasn't a driver who emerged. It was Frank, the head of Robert Davenport's security detail, a man whose loyalty to the family was absolute. Frank, who had once nodded respectfully to Nathaniel, now looked at him with an expression of cool professional indifference. "Mr. Pierce," Frank said, his voice flat. He offered no greeting, no sympathy. "Frank, what the hell is this? Where's my car?" Nathaniel demanded, trying to cling to one last shred of authority. "Your service has been terminated," Frank replied calmly. "I'm instructed to inform you that your access codes and keys for the Fifth Avenue residence have been deactivated. Your personal effects will be packed and delivered to your office tomorrow morning." He then held out a thick, legal-sized envelope. "And I was asked to give you this." Nathaniel snatched the envelope. His name was typed on the front. He tore it open. The first page read, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." Beneath it was a temporary restraining order, barring him from all Davenport properties and from contacting Josephine directly. He looked up from the papers, his world tilting on its axis. He saw the town car's back door close. Through the tinted rain-streaked window, he could just make out the elegant silhouette of Josephine. She was looking straight ahead. She didn't grant him so much as a final glance. The car pulled away from the curb with a quiet, powerful hum, merging seamlessly into the river of taillights on Wall Street. And Nathaniel Pierce was left standing on the wet pavement in the cold, unforgiving rain, with a sobbing mistress he no longer wanted divorce papers in his hand, and the crushing, suffocating knowledge that he had not just lost a fight. He had been a casualty in a war he never even knew he was fighting. He had mistaken a queen for a pawn, and she had swept him and his entire world off the board. 4 months later, the first heavy snow of the season was falling on Manhattan, a thick, silent blanket that muffled the city's relentless energy and turned the view from the Davenport Foundation's offices into a living watercolor. From her new corner office, her mother's old office, Josephine watched the flakes drift past the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city below, once the stage for her public humiliation and triumph, now seemed distant, a problem solved. The fallout from what the press had christened the Gala coup had been a roaring inferno that had systematically consumed Nathaniel Pierce's world. The story had a life of its own, becoming a parable of modern hubris. Nathaniel, the self-made titan, was now the poster child for catastrophic miscalculation. His desperate attempts at damage control, a series of disastrous interviews where he blamed the suffocating pressure of old money, only dug his grave deeper. The board of Pierce Innovations, facing a shareholder revolt and a PR nightmare that was eroding their stock value by the hour, had convened an emergency meeting. Within a week, he was ousted from the company he had built, forced out with a severance package that was insulting in its modesty. The much-vaunted Japanese merger evaporated. Deals he had spent years cultivating vanished overnight. He was radioactive. Chloe Decker had fared no better. After her tearful, self-serving television appearance was met with widespread derision, she was dropped by her modeling agency and became a social pariah. Her fleeting fame curdled into infamy, and she disappeared from public life, her Instagram account deactivated a ghost in the digital world she had so desperately tried to conquer. Josephine, in stark contrast, had become an unwilling but potent symbol of dignified strength. Magazine articles were written about her. Business schools taught the Davenport strategy as a masterclass in crisis management. And most importantly, the Starlight Children's Foundation flourished. Donations poured in, attracting a new younger generation of philanthropists inspired by her integrity. She had taken a legacy and made it a movement. Today was the final act, the closing of a chapter written in betrayal and pain. She was not in her own office, but in the sterile, soulless conference room of her lawyer's firm on the 60th floor of a midtown skyscraper. She sat at the head of a gleaming mahogany table flanked by her legal team. On the other side sat Nathaniel and his 2 lawyers, who looked as exhausted and beaten as their client. The man across from her was a stranger. The bespoke suits that once seemed molded to his powerful frame now hung on him a size too big. His face was gaunt with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless stress. The arrogant fire that had once burned in his gaze was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated emptiness. He looked not like a fallen titan, but simply like a man who had lost. The final divorce settlement lay between them. It was an unconditional surrender. He had tried to fight, to challenge the prenup, to paint her as vindictive. But her team had been merciless, presenting irrefutable evidence of his infidelity, his misappropriation of joint funds for his mistress, and the tangible damage his public conduct had inflicted on the family name and its associated business interests. He had been bled dry, outmaneuvered at every turn. The terms are clear. Josephine's lead counsel, a famously ruthless litigator named Benjamin Carter, said in a tone that allowed for no argument, Mr. Pierce will relinquish all claims to the Fifth Avenue property, the Hamptons estate, and all assets held in the Davenport Family Trust. In exchange, Miss Davenport will not pursue further civil damages. Nathaniel's lawyer nodded weakly. My client agrees. Carter slid the final signature page and a heavy, expensive fountain pen across the table. Then let's conclude this. Nathaniel stared at the paper, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the pen. Before he signed, he lifted his head and looked directly at Josephine, his eyes pleading for one last flicker of connection. Josie, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Was it worth it? To burn everything to the ground like this? Everything we had? The air in the room became heavy, the lawyers on both sides shifting uncomfortably. This was the moment Josephine had steeled herself for. She didn't respond with anger or pain. She answered with the cool, unshakable clarity he had forced her to find. You fundamentally misunderstand what happened, Nathaniel, she said, her voice even and calm. I didn't burn anything down. You were the one holding the match. You stood on a stage in a room full of my family, my friends, and my life's work. And you tried to set my world on fire for the sake of your ego. You just assumed I would stand there and burn with you. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. This wasn't about revenge. This was a course correction. I chose my future. I chose my child's future. The only thing that burned down was the facade you built, and you have no one to blame for that but yourself. The finality in her voice broke whatever was left of him. He flinched as if struck. Without another word, he uncapped the pen and signed his name. The scratch of the nib on the thick paper was the only sound in the room, a final definitive severing of their bond. His lawyers quickly gathered their papers and ushered him out of the room like a broken man. Josephine remained staring at his signature, a black scar on a white page. It was over. A wave of profound, bone-deep exhaustion washed over her, followed by an equally profound peace. Her father entered the room, having waited outside. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. It's done, he said softly. She nodded, taking a deep, cleansing breath. It's done. Your mother, he began, his voice thick with emotion. She would have been in awe of you, Josephine. She had grace. You have her grace, but you have your own brand of steel. You are stronger than any of us ever knew. 2 weeks later, in the quiet, sterile peace of a private suite at Lenox Hill Hospital, Josephine Davenport held her own new dawn in her arms. A beautiful, healthy baby girl with a tuft of auburn hair and eyes that seemed to hold a deep old wisdom. She named her Adrienne. Adrienne Davenport. A name of legacy, a name of strength, a name unburdened by the ghosts of the past. As she looked down at her daughter, the chaos of the last few months, the gala, the speeches, the lawyers, the public spectacle, all faded into insignificance. That had been a war of necessity. This right here was the victory. The takedown of Nathaniel Pierce wasn't her triumph. Her triumph was this quiet moment. It was the creation of a safe, honest, and powerful future for this tiny, perfect life in her arms. A future built not on a foundation of lies, but on a bedrock of Davenport integrity. A dynasty she thought not just preserved, but reborn. Josephine Davenport's story isn't just about a marriage ending. It's a masterclass in reclaiming power with grace, intelligence, and breathtaking precision. She faced the ultimate public betrayal, not with tears, but with a strategy that protected her future, her child, and her family's legacy. She reminded a world that often mistakes quietness for weakness, that the most effective victories are won not with loud shouting, but with calculated, decisive action. Her triumph wasn't just in divorcing a cheating husband, but in erasing his influence and building an even greater empire on the ashes of his mistakes. If her story of quiet strength and calculated victory resonated with you, please hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own inner power. And don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you won't miss our next story of unbelievable real-life drama. What do you think was Josephine's most powerful move? The speech, the integrity covenant, or the way she handled the final divorce? Let us know in the comments below.